The air in Washington was calm, but Karoline Leavitt knew better. Calm never lasted in this town, not when you were the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, and certainly not when a Supreme Court justice had just implied you belonged behind bars. She sat at the edge of her desk, scrolling through a dozen headlines that buzzed across the screen like flies on honey. "Barrett slams lawless leadership," read one. "Did Justice Barrett just call out Leavitt?" read another. But it wasn't just speculation. The video was clear. Amy Coney Barrett, seated before a room of law students at Georgetown, had looked straight into the camera and declared, "There are individuals today who manipulate the law to serve their agendas. Frankly, some belong in prison, not on press podiums." The room had erupted in quiet gasps. And so had the internet. Karoline didn't blink. She had faced celebrities, journalists, and members of Congress who tried to discredit her. But a Supreme Court justice? That was new, and it wasn't just personal. It was dangerous. When someone with a gavel said you belonged in prison, the world listened. Her phone buzzed. A text from her legal advisor. "We can respond. Just say the word." She typed back only 2 words. "Not yet." Because Karoline Leavitt didn't believe in reactive politics. She believed in preparation, timing, and something most underestimated about her: strategy. She rose from her desk, tugging slightly at the sleeves of her white blazer, the silver cross around her neck catching a glint of morning sun. Barrett might have worn a robe and spoken in legalese, but Karoline had something else on her side: her story, her fire, and the Constitution she knew page by page. They thought she was just a spokesperson. They forgot she had once planned to become a constitutional lawyer. They forgot she didn't need a robe to speak the truth. Now the question wasn't whether Karoline would respond. It was how and when she would make the entire country listen. The next morning, the story had already broken past political circles. It was everywhere. Morning shows debated it, newspapers quoted it, and social media turned it into a storm. Hashtags like Leavitt vs. Barrett and "You belong in prison" trended within hours. Clips from Barrett's speech were dissected by legal analysts, some cautiously agreeing with her tone, others calling it reckless. But none dared say what Karoline was thinking. She just broke the rules. Supreme Court justices were known to be restrained, impartial, guardians of law, not gladiators of public opinion. And yet Barrett had crossed the line from justice into politics. Not only had she accused Karoline without name, but she did it in a room full of future lawyers. She made it personal, and Karoline would not let that go unanswered. Karoline walked through the East Wing with her signature stride, confident, focused, unreadable. The silver cross around her neck rested just above her white blazer, her armor for what she knew was coming. Staffers parted as she moved, whispering behind their phones, unsure whether to treat her as a hero or a headline. She didn't care. She wasn't there to impress the White House. She was there to defend its voice. Inside the communications war room, her team sat tensely around a long oak table. Screens lit the walls, all broadcasting pundits debating the same question. Was Barrett's statement appropriate? Did she violate judicial neutrality? Karoline scanned the room, then nodded once. "I'm going to speak," she said. "But not from the press podium. Not yet." One of her aides looked up, confused. "Where then?" Karoline leaned forward. "Georgetown law. Same stage. Same setting. Live." Gasps followed. "You want to go toe-to-toe with a Supreme Court justice in her own arena?" another asked. Karoline's eyes narrowed, and the edge in her voice returned. "No," she said. "I want to remind America that no one is above the Constitution, not even a justice." Silence fell over the room. Not fear, respect. Her team had seen Karoline go head-to-head with politicians, media giants, even global activists. But this was different. This was Karoline Leavitt versus the robes of power themselves. By the end of the day, Georgetown University confirmed it. A public forum would be held. Barrett would be invited. Karoline would be there, alone if she had to. That night, she sat in her office under the dim glow of her desk lamp, poring over constitutional texts, past rulings, and Barrett's own written opinions. She wasn't coming for vengeance. She was coming for clarity, for truth, and for something far rarer in Washington: accountability. The auditorium at Georgetown Law buzzed with a tension that hadn't been felt since the Kavanaugh hearings. Rows of students, journalists, legal analysts, and public officials filled every seat, murmuring in anticipation. Cameras were already rolling. On one side of the stage stood a sleek wooden podium marked with the university seal. Behind it, a large banner: Law, Power, and Responsibility in Public Discourse. Coney Barrett hadn't confirmed her attendance, but she hadn't declined either. The event was already too big to cancel, and Karoline Leavitt knew it. She wasn't coming to ambush a Supreme Court justice. She was coming to speak on the same terms, on the same stage, in front of the same audience. But her weapon wouldn't be theatrics. It would be law. Backstage, Karoline stood alone in the green room, adjusting the collar of her white blazer. Her team had offered to be there, to feed her notes through an earpiece, but she refused. This was personal. She wanted to hear every question clearly, see every eyebrow raise, and feel every moment land like it mattered. Because it did. A soft knock came at the door. A stage coordinator peeked in. "You're up in 2 minutes," he said. "Just so you know, cameras are live. Barrett's not here, yet." Karoline nodded. "She will be." He hesitated. "You sure about this?" She looked up at him with calm conviction. "Let the court of public opinion convene," she said. As she walked onto the stage, applause met her. Not wild, but respectful. Georgetown was known for tough crowds, but also for open minds. She stood behind the podium, her fingers brushing the outline of the small Constitution booklet tucked into her inside pocket, like a blade she could draw at will. She looked out over the room, then into the nearest camera. "I didn't come here to defend my job," she began. "I came here to defend something older, deeper, and far more important: the right to speak truth without fear, even when that truth offends the powerful." There was a rustle in the crowd, students straightening, pens pausing. Karoline had everyone's attention. Her voice was calm, measured, never shrill. She didn't rant, she reasoned. And the more she spoke, the more the room leaned in. "You may disagree with me politically. That's your right. But calling for imprisonment without due process?" She paused, raising one eyebrow. "That's not justice. It's theater. And with all due respect to Justice Barrett, the bench is not a stage." A beat passed. Silence held. Then the rear doors creaked open. Heads turned. Barrett entered. She wore black as always, her hair tied back tightly, eyes unreadable. She walked slowly, deliberately, taking a seat in the front row. She didn't speak, but the message was clear. She was listening. Karoline didn't flinch. She turned her gaze toward Barrett, eyes locking for a moment. "And since Justice Barrett is here," Karoline said evenly, "I'd like to remind her of her own words from 2020. The law should never be used to silence dissent, no matter how unpopular." Gasps rippled across the room. Karoline didn't blink. She reached into her pocket and held up the Constitution. "This," she said, "is my script. And I won't be rewriting it to satisfy anyone's pride, robe or not." The room burst into applause, and for the first time in her career, Justice Barrett was not the one doing the questioning. For nearly a full minute after Karoline's last words, the room remained suspended in awe. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, precise, and utterly fearless. The Constitution still rested in her hand like a shield, her fingers tight around its spine. In the front row, Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat completely still, her hands folded in her lap. The only movement in her face, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. Karoline broke the silence. "I respect Justice Barrett's service to this country," she said, her tone leveling like a scalpel, not to wound, but to reveal. "But when someone with such authority speaks of prison in vague, veiled accusations, they cross a line. Not just against me, but against every citizen watching. She slowly placed the Constitution back into her blazer, eyes never leaving Barrett. I was raised in a middle-class home in New Hampshire. I wasn't born into politics or power, but I learned early that freedom of speech isn't granted by approval. It's guaranteed by law. Applause again, this time louder. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Barrett's reaction, searching for cracks. But the justice's face was stone, impenetrable. And yet, her fingers had begun to tap lightly on her knee. Karoline continued. You may not like how I speak. You may not like who I defend. But the moment we criminalize voices instead of actions, we begin to corrode the very justice we claim to protect. She paused. That's not democracy. That's hierarchy, dressed in robes. A student in the back gasped audibly. The crowd's energy shifted. Karoline had transformed a perceived weakness, her youth, her role as a press secretary, into raw authority. She wasn't standing on the defensive anymore. She had taken the courtroom and turned it into her own. That's when Barrett raised her hand. She didn't stand. She didn't ask to interrupt. She simply raised her hand like a professor in her own lecture hall. Karoline acknowledged her with a nod. Barrett's voice rang out, calm but clipped. Do you believe that questioning someone's ethics in the public interest is an abuse of judicial authority? Karoline didn't hesitate. No, ma'am, I believe opinion is your right, as it is mine. But when opinion becomes accusation, and accusation wears the robe of legal finality, yes, I believe that's dangerous. Barrett blinked. The room waited. She said nothing. Karoline took a breath, stepping back from the podium. Justice Barrett, if I have misrepresented your intent, I welcome correction. But if your words were meant to scare me into silence, they've had the opposite effect. And with that, she turned, gave a respectful nod, and left the podium. The applause this time wasn't polite. It was seismic. Coney Barrett remained seated, her expression unreadable, but something had shifted. She had come to listen. And instead, she'd been reminded that power doesn't always come from the bench. Sometimes it walks onto a stage in a white blazer, holding nothing but a pocket constitution and the truth. Karoline had barely stepped off the stage when her phone exploded with calls and notifications. Her team was waiting in the hallway, jaws clenched, eyes wide. One of them muttered, "That was historic." But Karoline didn't celebrate. She didn't even smile. She walked past them all, headed toward a small conference room nearby, and closed the door behind her. She needed quiet. She needed to think. Because while the applause still rang in the auditorium, something deeper had taken root. She had just challenged a Supreme Court justice, publicly, sharply, and Justice Barrett hadn't fired back. Yet. At that very moment, Amy Coney Barrett sat alone in the front row, unmoved. The crowd had begun to filter out, buzzing with commentary, debate, and awe. But Barrett stayed seated. Her clerks hesitated to approach. She stared straight ahead, her eyes locked not on the stage, but on the empty podium where Karoline had stood minutes earlier. She didn't feel angry. She felt startled. Not because a young press secretary had challenged her, but because the challenge had been so exact, so measured. Karoline hadn't ranted. She hadn't postured. She had pulled lines from Barrett's own past rulings and used them like mirrors, revealing cracks the justice hadn't realized were visible. For the first time in a long time, Barrett felt something unfamiliar. Self-doubt. Back in the White House, Karoline sat with her team. They had already clipped the speech, edited it, and prepped it for social media release. Aides argued over the best thumbnail, a close-up of Karoline holding the Constitution, or the moment she directly addressed Barrett. Karoline raised a hand. "No dramatics," she said. "Just the truth. Show the full exchange, unedited. Let people decide." One of her aides hesitated. "Even the moment she questions you directly?" Karoline nodded. "Especially that." Meanwhile, newsrooms across the country were already reacting. CNN's evening panel debated whether Barrett had overstepped. MSNBC praised Karoline's calm. Fox News ran with the headline, "Karoline schools Barrett with her own words." On X, formerly Twitter, hashtags were exploding. Sure, Karoline Leavitt Barrett, judged by truth, sure constitutional clapback. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in a quiet office at the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett sat behind her desk, watching the video replay. Again and again. She didn't wince. She didn't frown. She watched like a scholar, studying her opponent. For that's what Karoline had become now. Not a press secretary, not a political spokesperson. A constitutional opponent. Barrett leaned back, her hands steepled under her chin. "This isn't over," she whispered. And she was right, because Karoline had only just begun. The next morning, Washington woke up to a political earthquake. Karoline's speech had racked up over 12 million views overnight. Her direct confrontation with Justice Barrett was now being called one of the most daring constitutional challenges of the decade. Late-night shows played clips on repeat. Editorials buzzed with debate. Was Karoline right to speak so boldly? Had Barrett compromised her impartiality? But inside the Supreme Court, things were moving faster than the headlines. Amy Coney Barrett stood at the center of a quiet storm. Clerks moved carefully around her office. She wasn't speaking to the press. She wasn't writing op-eds. She was reviewing something much more powerful, a formal complaint, sent directly from the Federal Judicial Conduct Review Board. It had been triggered by public concern over her "you belong in prison" remark. Karoline hadn't filed it, but someone close to her had. And it was gaining traction. That afternoon, Karoline received a short email. No greeting, no signature. "You're not just a spokesperson anymore. You've started something much larger. Be ready." She knew who it was from, and she knew what it meant. The backlash was coming, not just from the media or politics, but from within the legal system itself. By noon, her name was being floated on legal podcasts and Twitter threads, not as a politician, but as someone who could argue in front of the Supreme Court. Law students clipped her lines like gospel. Conservative circles called her a defender of First Amendment integrity. Progressives surprisingly admitted she was right about judicial overreach. And then came the leak. One of Barrett's junior clerks anonymously spoke to the press. Justice Barrett underestimated her. She didn't expect Leavitt to use constitutional precedent as a weapon. And now she's facing internal scrutiny for crossing a boundary she swore to uphold. Karoline, for the first time in days, allowed herself to smile. Not because Barrett was under fire, but because the system was responding, not to noise, not to spin, to truth. Still, the war was far from over. That evening, as Karoline walked through the West Wing, a senior aide stopped her. "She's requested a private meeting." Karoline froze. "Barrett?" The aide nodded. "Here, tonight." Silence lingered for a beat. Then Karoline took a breath, straightened her blazer, and said, "Good. Let's see what she has to say. Off the record. Because not every battle needs cameras. Some wars are fought across tables in quiet rooms, between two women who both know the law and aren't afraid to use it." The Roosevelt Room was quiet, its dark wood and velvet chairs holding decades of secrets. Presidents had signed treaties here. Wars had been ended, begun, or denied within these walls. But tonight, it would host something far more rare. A private meeting between a sitting Supreme Court justice and the White House press secretary she had publicly condemned. Karoline arrived first. She wore a navy blue blazer this time, more subdued than the white she wore on stage. No cameras, no mic. Just her voice and her convictions. She stood by the fireplace, staring into the unlit hearth until the door creaked open behind her. Amy Coney Barrett entered without an escort. No robe, no entourage, just a tailored black coat and a folder tucked under one arm. She looked tired, but not weak. They sat across from each other at the long conference table. For a long time, neither spoke. Barrett broke the silence. "I didn't expect you to quote my own rulings." Karoline met her gaze. "You didn't expect me to read them." Barrett smirked, just slightly. "That was my mistake." A beat passed. The folder on Barrett's side remained untouched. "You crossed a line," Karoline said quietly. "You know that." Barrett nodded. "And so did you. In a different way." Karoline didn't flinch. "I answered an accusation with precedent. If that's crossing a line, Maybe the line needs to move. Barrett leaned back, folding her hands. You understand how dangerous this moment is? Yes, Karoline replied. But not for me. Barrett's eyes narrowed. You think I'm afraid of losing credibility? No, Karoline said calmly. I think you're afraid of losing control. The room grew heavier with silence. Barrett finally opened the folder, revealing a printed transcript of Karoline's speech at Georgetown. It had been marked, underlined, highlighted, annotated. I don't take back what I said, Barrett began. But I do regret how I said it. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Because it was wrong, or because it made you look bad? Barrett's answer came without hesitation. Because it gave you power I didn't intend. There it was. The truth between them wasn't hatred. It was recognition. Each saw something familiar in the other. Ambition, precision, a refusal to yield. Barrett closed the folder. So what now? Karoline leaned forward. You stop using the court as a pulpit, and I stop treating you like a politician. And if we don't? Karoline's voice was steel. Then we keep going. But next time, it won't be in a room like this. It'll be before the people. And I'm not afraid of that. Barrett studied her, eyes searching, calculating, impressed in spite of herself. Then slowly, she stood. Neither am I. They didn't shake hands. There was no peace accord. But something passed between them as Barrett walked toward the door. Respect, wariness, understanding. Karoline remained seated, her heart steady. She had just faced down a Supreme Court justice in private, the same way she had in public, unshaken. And the battle wasn't over. It was only evolving. By morning, the private meeting wasn't private anymore. A single sentence posted anonymously to a political blog sent shockwaves through Washington. Sources confirmed Justice Barrett met with Karoline Leavitt off the record. Neither denied it. Within hours, every major outlet picked it up. Was there a truce? Had Barrett apologized? Had Karoline backed down? Speculation ran wild. The White House refused comment. So did the Supreme Court. But the silence only fueled the fire. Inside the West Wing, Karoline stared at the headline flashing across her monitor. She hadn't leaked anything. Neither had her staff. Which meant someone else had. And that changed everything. Because now, the war wasn't just between two women. It had spilled into institutions. An emergency panel of legal ethics scholars was announced by noon, called to investigate whether Barrett's prison remark had violated judicial decorum. At the same time, conservative passies launched a counterattack, claiming Karoline was weaponizing the Constitution for career gain. Karoline didn't flinch. She had expected this. When you fight power, it doesn't yield quietly. It strikes back through proxies. But what she didn't expect was the letter, delivered by hand. No return address, no signature. Just a single line, typed on official Supreme Court stationery. I see your fire, Miss Leavitt. Don't burn yourself with it. She stared at the words for a long time. Was it a warning? A threat? A twisted compliment? In any case, it was too late. The next day, Karoline stepped into a live interview on national television. No podium, no press room. Just her, a chair, and millions of viewers. The host asked the obvious. Did you meet with Justice Barrett? Karoline didn't blink. Yes. What did you say to her? I reminded her, Karoline replied, that power without accountability isn't justice. It's monarchy. The quote went viral before the interview even ended. TikTok, X, YouTube, clips exploded with commentary. Teens posted memes of Karoline with sunglasses and the caption, "Not afraid of robes." Lawyers debated the long-term implications. Historians called it a generational clash. And behind closed doors, something else happened. A junior senator introduced a new transparency bill, the Judicial Ethics Responsibility Act, designed to require justices to disclose political statements made in public forums. Its name was unofficial, But everyone already had a shorthand for it: the Leavitt rule. In just 1 week, Karoline had gone from being targeted to being studied. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was reshaping the conversation. And Barrett? She was learning that in the age of information, power doesn't just sit on a bench. It moves in the hearts of those who refuse to stay silent. 3 days after the leak, the Supreme Court itself finally stirred. In a rare public memo, the Judicial Review Council announced it would formally evaluate whether Justice Amy Coney Barrett's remarks about Karoline Leavitt violated the ethical standards expected of members of the bench. It wasn't a trial, but it was serious, and it was unprecedented. Barrett was silent. Karoline wasn't. At a packed press conference on the Capitol steps, Karoline stood beneath a cascade of microphones and reporters shouting her name. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. Instead, she held up a slim blue book, the U.S. Constitution, the same one she'd carried to Georgetown. "The Constitution doesn't just protect the powerful," she began. "It protects all of us, loud or quiet, famous or forgotten. And it certainly protects those who speak uncomfortable truths." Reporters fell silent. "I never asked to be part of a judicial controversy," she said. "But if standing up to power is controversial, then so be it." As she left the podium, someone shouted, "Do you want her off the bench?" Karoline paused mid-step, then turned. "I don't want retribution. I want reflection." It wasn't the answer they expected, but it was the answer that echoed. That same night, inside the Supreme Court, Barrett read the transcript of Karoline's words. Again. She sat at her desk long after the lights in other chambers had gone dark. Her robe hung over a coat rack. Her glasses sat folded beside a cold cup of tea. She was no longer just a justice. She was the subject of scrutiny. And in that quiet, she faced the truth Karoline had exposed. Not that she had made a mistake, but that she had stopped expecting to be held accountable. Karoline hadn't humiliated her. She had humbled her. Barrett opened a drawer and pulled out her handwritten draft of a statement she had begun 2 nights earlier. A speech of clarification. It had felt like an explanation, an excuse. But now it felt inadequate. In her mind, she heard Karoline's voice again. Power without accountability isn't justice. It's monarchy. The next morning, Barrett shocked the country. From the steps of the Supreme Court itself, she appeared alone, no robe, no shield. And in a statement carried live across every major network, she addressed the nation with a level of self-awareness few had ever seen from the highest court. "I believe in the law," she said, "but I also believe in growth. My words toward Miss Leavitt were sharp, inappropriate, and unbecoming of the position I hold. And for that, I apologize. Not only to her, but to the country." The crowd gasped. Reporters went silent. And in living rooms across America, viewers watched something rare. A justice, holding herself accountable. Karoline watched it too, from her office in the West Wing, arms crossed, jaw tight. Her phone lit up. It was a text from her mother. "You didn't win a fight, sweetheart. You changed the rules of engagement." And maybe that's what mattered most. 1 week after Justice Amy Coney Barrett's public apology, the nation was still processing what had just unfolded. A Supreme Court justice had admitted fault. A 27-year-old press secretary had sparked the moment. But for Karoline Leavitt, this wasn't about victory. It was about visibility, of what unchecked authority looks like, of what standing up actually costs. In the White House press briefing room, reporters no longer asked about trivial updates. They leaned forward, pens ready, as if every word might carry the same charge as her Georgetown speech. But Karoline didn't seek drama. She gave facts. Clear, calm, constitutional. That night, she appeared on national television. Not as Trump's spokesperson, not as a culture warrior, but as a guest on a special edition of 60 Minutes. The interviewer asked, "Did you expect the apology?" Karoline looked down for a moment, then back up. "Number. But I did expect accountability, and I think the American people did too." Some say you embarrassed the court. She shook her head. I didn't embarrass anyone. I held up a mirror, and we all saw what was in it. When asked what came next, she answered without hesitation. Now we make sure this doesn't happen again. Not just from judges, from anyone in power who thinks disagreement is a crime. The segment closed with a slow pan of Karoline at her desk, reading a letter, handwritten, from Barrett. It didn't say much, just a few sentences. You reminded me that robes don't make us right, only our integrity does. Thank you, Karoline folded it gently and placed it into a file labeled, Not for Show. Meanwhile, across the country, something remarkable was happening. Law schools added her Georgetown speech to syllabi on free speech and constitutional boundaries. Young conservatives and liberals alike posted clips with captions like, "She fought the system and made it blink." And in Washington, the newly proposed Leavitt Doctrine, a formal clause mandating ethical clarity in public statements by federal justices, cleared its first legislative hurdle. It wasn't law yet, but it was a start. One night, Karoline stood alone on the steps of the Supreme Court. No cameras. Just her, the cool marble beneath her shoes, and the weight of what had just changed. She looked up at the grand facade etched with the words, "Equal justice under law." And she whispered to herself, almost like a promise, not just for the powerful, for all of us. In a time when power often hides behind titles and tradition, one voice challenged the system and made it listen. Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend herself, she demanded accountability from one of the most powerful figures in American law. And in doing so, she reminded the nation, being young doesn't mean being wrong, and wearing a robe doesn't make you untouchable. This story wasn't about revenge, it was about responsibility. And maybe that's what America needs most right now. Not more noise, but more courage. If this inspired you, subscribe to Surprising Stories for more powerful moments like this, because the truth deserves to be heard.